All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at a genuinely fascinating scientific mystery. We're going way back into the deep past to explore some recent discoveries that, honestly, completely upend the standard story we've all been taught about who we are and where we come from.
Think about the version of human history you probably learned back in, say, 6th grade. It's a very specific straight-line kind of story, right? The idea is we started out in these simple, primitive bands of hunter-gatherers and then slowly, inevitably, marched toward complex civilization, agriculture, and the modern state. It's a story of straight-line progress. But what if everything we learned about that progression is actually wrong?
To figure this out, we're drawing on this really groundbreaking compilation of recent archaeological and anthropological data. It's a book called The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. And what this research does is investigate exactly why that conventional narrative might be way off base and how our actual history was, well, a whole lot more diverse and interesting.
Let's start with Section 1, the myth of our origins.
To understand this, we first need to look at two big, contrasting ideas that have dominated our history textbooks for literally centuries. Over on the left, you've got the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes. He claimed early human life was nasty, brutish, and short, basically just a constant, miserable state of war until governments and police came along to save us from ourselves. But then, on the right, you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau's view. He argued we were these innocent, egalitarian, noble savages living in a pristine Eden right up until the invention of agriculture created private property and ruined everything. So, according to the textbooks, we were either savage apes or innocent foragers. Here's the catch, though. Both of these philosophical views share a massive limitation. They totally rely on this idea of the stupid savage. Basically, they treat early humans like they were just sitting around, twiddling their thumbs, waiting for the magic spark of progress to happen. It completely assumes our ancestors didn't have the capacity to think critically about how they organized themselves. It just assumes they lacked intelligence.
Which leads us to Section 2, early humans were like us.
Because, as it turns out, the hard archaeological data paints a completely different picture. It shows that our prehistoric ancestors were highly conscious, creative political actors. They absolutely weren't stuck in just one single primitive way of life. They actively debated, they experimented, and they consciously chose from a vast variety of social structures. They were honestly just people, like us, equally perceptive and equally confused. They were every bit as smart and socially aware as we are today. For example, early groups actively practiced what scholars call seasonal dualism. Take the Inuit. In the summer, they dispersed into these patriarchal bands with strict, coercive leaders and fiercely guarded property. But then, in the winter, they gathered into large communal towns, shared their wealth, and completely subverted that authority. Think about that. They totally reorganized their laws and hierarchies depending on the time of year. It's kind of like how our modern holidays briefly reverse our social norms, but on a massive structural scale. They didn't just stumble into a political system, they intentionally changed it with the weather.
Moving on to Section 3, farming wasn't a trap.
So, if early humans were incredibly flexible and, unstuck, we have to ask why we all believe agriculture suddenly trapped us in these rigid hierarchies. We've all heard of the agricultural revolution, right? This supposed sudden overnight switch where humans discovered farming, immediately claimed private property, and ruined their equality forever. Well, the actual timeline tells a totally different story. Look at the Middle East. Humans were gathering wild grains around 10,000 BC. They started early cultivation experiments around 7,000 BC, but fully established farming communities, those didn't pop up until 4,000 BC. Guys, that is a 3,000-year transition. That is definitely not an overnight revolution.
The really crucial point here is that early agriculture was treated as a reversible experiment. Scholars actually call it play farming or slow wheat. Our ancestors didn't just blindly rush into a permanent trap with wheat. They casually experimented with it while still hunting and foraging on the side. Farming wasn't this inevitable march toward private property and oppressive states. For thousands of years, it was really just one of many tools they used whenever it suited them.
Next up, Section 4, cities built without kings. Now, we're constantly told that once human populations gathered in large numbers, having rulers and bossy bureaucrats was absolutely necessary to keep everyone in line. But again, the archaeological record completely challenges the idea that scale forces hierarchy. In Ukraine, archaeologists have dug up ancient megasites housing thousands of people with absolutely zero signs of centralized government. No palaces, no central administration. Over in early Mesopotamia, cities operated with large democratic councils long before they ever had kings.
And in the Americas, the massive city of Teotihuacan actually stopped building monuments for rulers entirely and instead embarked on these massive, high-quality social housing projects for everyday citizens. They successfully managed vast, complex cities without any authoritarian rulers pulling the strings.
So, how did these cultures decide to organize themselves? Well, often, it was through a process called schismogenesis. It's a big word, but it just means the process where human societies intentionally try to demonstrate they are entirely different from their neighbors. For example, indigenous peoples of the Pacific Coast developed totally different social rules, like actively rejecting slavery when the folks next door practiced it, simply to distinguish themselves. This proves that social structures were very often conscious, deliberate choices.
Which brings us to Section 5, the 3 basic freedoms.
What were the underlying principles that allowed our ancestors to maintain this incredible flexibility for thousands and thousands of years? Well, for most of human history, 3 basic freedoms were just taken for granted. Number 1, the freedom to move away or relocate. Number 2, the freedom to ignore or disobey commands. And number 3, the freedom to shape entirely new social realities. Because you could always just pack up and walk away or simply refuse to listen without facing violence, any leader back then was essentially a play king. Their power was 100% dependent on their ability to persuade you, not force you.
Actually, a super interesting fact here. The earliest word for freedom recorded in any human language is the Sumerian term amagi, which literally translates to return to mother. This early concept of freedom meant debt cancellation and the physical ability to just return home to your kin. It highlights just how absolutely central the freedom of physical movement was to early societies. If things got bad or a leader got too bossy, you could literally just go back to your mother's house.
Let's look at Section 6. How did we get stuck?
This brings us to the ultimate question, doesn't it? If we lived for tens of thousands of years as these free, creative, political actors, how exactly did we get stuck? How did we end up in the rigid, modern socioeconomic systems we live in today? Well, the research shows that the components of the modern state, things like sovereignty, bureaucracy, and competitive politics, have entirely separate, really humble origins. They started out as what are called first-order regimes. These were ancient political systems that magnified just one single type of domination. So maybe a ruler used violence, or maybe they controlled secret knowledge, or perhaps they just had massive charisma. But these distinct forces didn't all fuse together into the overarching modern state until much, much later in history.
To picture how we lost that flexibility, think of the freedom to disobey and the freedom to move away as the legs of a stool. They acted as the foundational scaffolding that allowed early humans to reach up and experiment with that third freedom, creating entirely new societies. As long as you had those first 2 freedoms firmly under your feet, you were totally safe to experiment.
But over time, we gradually surrendered those first 2 freedoms. Often this happened through the enforcement of permanent private property and military expansion. And doing that essentially kicked the stool right out from under us. We started stepping into systems we simply couldn't step out of. Without the freedom to move away or the freedom to disobey, we lost the ability to imagine and create new social realities. We were left stuck in permanent hierarchies.
So the crucial question we want to leave you with today is this. If our ancient ancestors could completely reinvent their societies from season to season and year to year, why can't we? The historical record strongly suggests that our current political and economic rigidity wasn't just some unavoidable consequence of human nature or the invention of planting wheat. It's really just one of many possibilities. And honestly, knowing we have a deep, proven historical capacity for change, well, that is definitely something worth thinking about.